Hello, in this video I'm going to talk about the major human body cavities and some of the membranes that we find inside of them. So the human body has several cavities or spaces inside of it, and most of these spaces are not empty, they're filled with fluids or organs. When we look at the human body, we see there's two major body cavities: the dorsal body cavity, which is towards the back, and the ventral body cavity, which is towards the front. The dorsal body cavity is much less complicated. The dorsal body cavity includes other cavities like the cranial cavity, which encloses the brain, and the spinal cavity, which encloses the spinal cord. And there's a membrane found in the dorsal body cavity, and this membrane is called the meninges, and you might have heard of a condition called meningitis, which occurs when the meninges become inflamed. So that's really all I'm going to talk about with regards to the dorsal body cavity. The ventral body cavity is a bit more complicated. So the ventral body cavity is towards the front of the body, and it includes two major subdivisions: the thoracic cavity and the abdominal pelvic cavity. That last one's a tongue twister. Okay. So the thoracic cavity is found above the diaphragm, your major muscle for breathing, while the abdominal pelvic cavity is found below the diaphragm. So the diaphragm actually physically separates these two parts of the ventral body cavity. There was no physical separation in the dorsal body cavity. As a matter of fact, the cranial cavity and the spinal cavity are continuous one with another, and they even share a fluid that flows through them called cerebrospinal fluid. Anyways, coming back to the ventral body cavity. So if we look at just the thoracic cavity for a minute, we can actually see that there are even more cavities inside of there. Okay? Enclosing the lungs, we find the pleural cavities. Okay? But between the lungs, there's a space, and that space is referred to as the mediastinum. And the mediastinum includes several organs within it. The heart is in there, but also some large tubes like the esophagus and the trachea are in there, and there's blood vessels and other things in there, but that's the majority. Now, looking at the heart, we see the heart is enclosed by another cavity called the pericardial cavity. Okay. So that's pretty much it for the thoracic body cavity. If we move below the diaphragm, we come to that abdominal pelvic cavity that I mentioned, and it itself is separated into two subdivisions: the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. Now, there's no true barrier separating the abdominal cavity from the pelvic cavity, but the top of the bladder is a good reference point. So the bladder kind of separates the abdominal cavity from the pelvic cavity. The abdominal cavity contains the majority of your digestive organs, so there's a lot of organs in there. And there is another cavity inside of the abdominal cavity, and that's called the Peritoneal Cavity. And it encloses many of the organs within there. So examples of some organs we're going to find associated with the abdominal cavity and the subsequent peritoneal cavity include like your large intestine, your small intestine, stomach, spleen, pancreas, as examples. Now, if we go into the pelvic cavity contains the bladder and some of the reproductive organs. What I'd like to do now is to talk about the membranes that we find associated with some of the ventral body cavities. So with the dorsal body cavity, we had a membrane, a sheet-like structure called meninges, and this sheet-like structure of cells and organic substances is a nice, tight, protective barrier. And in the ventral body cavity, we also have sheet-like structures called serous membranes, and these membranes are protective, but they also have a major job of reducing friction. Because in the ventral body cavity, we have moving parts. And wherever you have moving parts, you have the potential for friction. So the serous membranes have the job of producing a lubricating fluid called serous fluid that helps to reduce friction around moving parts. And serous membranes have a very unique structure to them. They are a double membrane system, so there's two layers of membrane, and you notice I didn't stack them right on top of each other. That's because there's a space between them, And that space is important. It contains the lubricating fluid that I mentioned. The two layers to the serous membrane have special names. The layer that's closest to an organ is called the visceral layer. Visceral means guts. You probably heard the word visceral reaction before, or maybe you've heard the term viscera used to refer to like guts. So visceral means guts, and it means organs. So the visceral layer is the one that lies right on top of the organ, right on top of the guts. The other layer, the layer that's further away from the organ, that layer is called the parietal layer of the serous membrane. Right? So the parietal layer is going to be further from the organ, and it's going to be more superficial. So the visceral layer is deep, and the parietal layer is superficial. And between the two is a space, a cavity that's filled with the lubricating serous fluid. So the organ that's underneath the visceral layer is going to be a moving organ like the heart. And these membranes and the fluid help to reduce the friction as that organ moves. In the picture here, we see a good analogy for how to remember the basic structure to a serous membrane. What we have is a fist pushing into a balloon, right? And the wall of the balloon that's touching the fist, that would be equivalent to the visceral layer of the serous membrane. And then there's a space in the balloon, and the balloon is filled with air, right? Unless it's a water balloon that's filled with water, right? But in this membrane system, the space would be filled with that serous fluid, that lubricating fluid. And then there's the layer of the balloon that's furthest away from the fist, and that would be the equivalent of the parietal layer. What I'd like to do now is talk about the three major serous membranes associated with the ventral body cavity, and those are the pericardium, the pleurae, and the peritoneum. So as you might have guessed, the pericardium is associated with the heart, and the pericardium is a serous membrane, so it is a double layer system. Okay. So on screen here I have what is supposed to be the equivalent of the heart itself. So that's the heart muscle, the cardiac muscle tissue. Okay. So to have a serous membrane system, we have to have two layers of membrane with a space. Right? So this layer represented by the blue line, this is representing the visceral layer of the pericardium. We call it the visceral pericardium. Okay. And now we have the parietal pericardium. So this is the layer of the pericardium that's further away from the heart itself. And in between the two is a space represented by yellow, right? And this would be the pericardial cavity. And the pericardial cavity is filled with a fluid, a type of serous fluid called pericardial fluid, which is a lubricating fluid. So take a close look at this picture and you'll notice that the heart is not inside the pericardial cavity. The pericardial cavity encloses the heart, it surrounds the heart, but the heart is not in the pericardial cavity. The pericardial cavity is filled with a fluid, and this is a common misconception that students have. Actually, it's a common misconception that textbooks have and instructors have. There aren't any organs inside of a serous membrane cavity. There's fluid inside that cavity, but the cavity does surround or enclose an organ too. So this is true not only for the heart, but also for the pleurae, which are the serous membranes that enclose the lungs. So when we look at the lungs, we see that we have a visceral layer to the membrane called the visceral pleura. Then there's a space called the pleural cavity, and then there's the parietal pleura. Right? So you have that visceral cavity parietal system again enclosing the lungs. The lungs are not in the pleural cavities, but they are surrounded by them. And same thing happens when we look at the digestive organs in the abdominal cavity, right? We have a visceral peritoneum that lies right on the outside of the digestive organs, and then there's a rather large space called the peritoneal cavity. It's one of the biggest spaces in the body. We utilize it often in medicine, like they'll shunt fluids from the brain down to that cavity, or the cavity actually can be used for dialysis type purposes. Anyways, so we still have that visceral cavity parietal system because there is a layer in the abdominal cavity called the parietal peritoneum, and basically that lines the walls of the peritoneal cavity. So hopefully this video has helped you out with learning about the human body cavities and serous membranes.